welcome for all of you who are tuned in. You're watching TMH Live as we present you our daily English news. Our headlines for today: the International Crisis Group says the risk of large-scale attacks on civilians in Tigray is extremely high right now. The African Union sets for Monday starting to Ethiopian peace talks, and dozens of women and girls raped, hundreds of civilians killed in the most recent offensives in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. As we move on to our main updates for today, the International Crisis Group says the risk of large-scale attacks on civilians in Tigray is high. The International Crisis Group, also known as the ICG, called on the African and the world leaders to take urgent action to prevent an even worse humanitarian catastrophe in the Tigray region. ICG made the call in its latest report on the war on Tigray under the title, "A Call to Action, Averting Atrocities in Ethiopia's Tigray War." The report said a 7-week Ethiopian federal and Eritrean offensives in Ethiopia's northernmost region of Tigray risked degenerating into a still bloodier phase, with federal and Eritrean forces targeting civilians. According to the ICG, federal troops are pushing into Tigray on several fronts alongside Eritrean soldiers and forces from the Amhara region, which borders Tigray as well. It noted that Asmara may well have ruthless designs with respect to Tigray, and it's nearly impervious to outside pressure. Eritrea's longtime ruler, President Isaias Afwerki, forces have already engaged in widespread atrocities in the present war's first phase, including a massacre of scores of people in cities like Aksum, which was confirmed by Ethiopia's government themselves. Isaias views Tigray's forces as an existential threat, and the war has also seen a surge in dehumanizing hate speech by the government officials as well as TPLF opponents, in which all more potent against the backdrop of federal actions to collectively punish Tigrayan civilians. A UN document seen by the crisis group recorded multiple civilian deaths from airstrikes over the last 2 months, and it also said Ethiopian and Eritrean soldiers executed 46 civilians in Shimbala village in northern West Tigray between the 6th and the 12th of September. The document states that since the 24th of August, almost 500,000 people displaced by fighting in the area as well as southwest of Shira near the Amhara-Tigray border. All of this is occurring onset of the main harvest season in a devastated region that is heavily dependent on agriculture. Sources close to Tigray's authorities claim that many more atrocities have occurred during the offensive, though no one has presented evidence of such additional crimes. ICG added that the federal and Amhara and Eritrean region blockades of Tigray shows no sign of abating, and the UN experts also believe that the federal government's siege strategy, repeatedly restricting the region's access to the humanitarian relief, while also cutting off trade, transport, bank services, electricity, telecommunications, amongst much more, and amounts to the crime of using starvation as a method of warfare. Nothing suggests that Addis Ababa and Asmara will soon scale back any of these tactics. ICG said at its first step, continental and regional statesmen, with Abiy's ear and anyone able to speak to Isaias Afwerki, should impress upon them the imperative of halting this continuous bloodshed. Leaders such as Kenya's William Ruto, Ghana's Nana Akufo-Addo, Uganda's Yoweri Museveni, Senegal's Macky Sall, South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa, and Angola's João Lourenço should urge Abiy to go to the negotiating table rather than battle an insurgency that could be long and bloody to continue. ICG advised and support the encouragement from the US and other Western powers. The leaders of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia should press their allies in Asmara and Addis Ababa to restrain their forces and commit to peace talks. All external actors should keep insisting in the Union that Asmara withdraw its troops from Tigray immediately, as they underlined in their article. ICG also said that the US President Joe Biden should attempt to speak with Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki to stress that the Ethiopian and Eritrean officials will face clear consequences should the forces under their command systematically continue to attack civilians. African and international actors need to move with far greater cohesion, urgency, and focus to arrest the violence unfolding currently in Ethiopia's Tigray region. The African Union has set a date on Monday to start the Ethiopian peace talks. Peace talks on the war in Ethiopia will start on Monday in South Africa, as the following of the African Union said on Friday. Earlier comments by the government and the Tigray forces to participate. Both sides had committed to talks earlier this month, but they were delayed for logistical reasons. The African Union's Peace and Security Council said on Friday it welcomed mutual commitments to genuinely participate in this peace process. Diplomats have urged the parties to agree to immediate ceasefire. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has most recently described the situation in Tigray as spiraling out of control, and the USAID Administrator Samantha Powers also warned of the potential for further widespread atrocities in northern Ethiopia if the fighting persists. It wasn't immediately clear who will mediate the new talks planned for the 24th of October. Authorities in Tigray didn't immediately respond, but previously stated that the readiness is there to participate in these talks. Eba Kalondo, who's the spokesperson for the chairman of the African Union Commission, told the Associated Press that the AU process for direct talks between the parties is currently on track, but would not confirm the date or the venue for these such talks. Aid distributions have been hampered by a lack of fuel, communication blackout in Tigray, as the AP reported Saturday. The UN team found that there was 10 starvation-related deaths at the 7 camps for the internally displaced people in northwestern Tigray, according to, once again, an internal document. While out in field, Tigray government releases over 9,000 Eritrean and Ethiopian prisoners of war. Tigray TV reported today that the government of Tigray has released over 9,000 Eritrean and Ethiopian prisoners of war, including 500 of them being women. The station reported that these prisoners of war were released because the enemy in Ethiopian government is not the frontline soldiers who they said were forced to fight to begin with. In the same breath, dozens of women and girls raped and hundreds of civilians killed in the most recent offensive in the Tigray region. According to an official document seen by the Associated Press, roughly 40 girls, women between the ages of 13 and 80, were raped in the town of Shararo in the northwestern Tigray region. The document is compiled by Tigray's Regional Emergency Coordination Center, which includes regional government bureaus and UN agencies and non-governmental organizations, and diplomats have expressed alarm over reports of civilian casualties in the region as Ethiopia's federal military this week took control of the major town of Shira, as the federal government expressed its aim to capture Tigray's airports and federal institutions. A humanitarian worker based in Shira told AP that the town's airport is now manned by Eritrean forces, and Ethiopian Eritrean forces have captured the warehouses belonging to NGOs there, as well as the forces are specifically looting vehicles, according to the aid workers, who speak on conditions of anonymity because of safety of their fears. UN Security Council discussed that the conflict in Ethiopia at a closed meeting Friday, but didn't issue any statement because of the division among the 15 members, and U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, in a statement, called that disappointing, citing the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres when he said this week that the situation in Ethiopia is currently spiraling out of control. In the past week alone, we've seen serious uptick in the fighting and violence, as she said in a statement, continuing to add the scale of the fighting and the deaths rival what we are seeing in Ukraine, and the innocent civilians are currently being caught in the crossfire. The internal document seen by the AP said 159 individuals have been shot dead in Tigray, Dedebit and Tsalemti areas of northwestern Tigray, adding that others were maimed by gunshots and shellings as well. A further 157 people were taken by Eritrean forces in Tsalemti, Dedebit, and Shararo, according to this document, in which they said there was no further information on their whereabouts currently. The latest fighting has halted aid deliveries into the region, where around 5 million people need humanitarian help. A lack of fuel and communication blackouts are hindering the distribution of aid supplies that were already in the region as well. UN genocide official says hate speech is fueling the war on Tigray. A UN official is urging tech companies to do everything possible to stop the onslaught of hate speech and the fueling of this ongoing war in northern Tigray, where a violent war pits federal and Eritrean troops as their allies against Tigray forces. Inflammatory language by political leaders Armed groups in the Tigray conflict continue unabated, as Alice Weiremu, a UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, said in a statement on Wednesday. There is a disclosure of often propagated through social media, which dehumanizes groups by likening them to a virus that should be eradicated, to a cancer that should be treated, because if a single cell is left untreated, the cell will expand and affect the entire body, she added. She also said hate speech mongers are calling for the killing of every single youth from Tigray, which is particularly dangerous, as she continued to add within her statement. The AU and Peace Security Council meets in Ethiopia ahead of the UN's meeting this week. The African Union Peace and Security Council held a session today to receive a briefing on this ongoing AU-led peace process for Ethiopia. Today's meeting was not initially included in the monthly program of work of Council, and according to Amani Africa, it comes in the immediate wake of yet another private meeting by the UN Security Council scheduled to take place later today under the Peace and Security in Africa agenda item. Ahead of today's meeting by the AU and the UN Security Councils, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke yesterday with a UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and according to Readabouts, during the discussion, Secretary Blinken expressed his grave concern about the intensification of fighting in North Ethiopia and the risk of the mass atrocities, as Blinken understood the need for an immediate cessation of hostilities, complete unhindered humanitarian access, good faith in the AU-led talks, and within the next weeks for Eritrea to completely withdraw its forces from northern Ethiopia as well. On the 17th of October, Antonio Guterres issued an unprecedented statement in which he warned that the situation in Ethiopia was spiraling out of control. The social fabric is being ripped apart, civilians are paying a horrific price, and hostilities in Tigray must end now, including the immediate withdrawal and the disengagement of Eritrean forces from Ethiopia, as the Secretary General added. Ambassador Taye Astakaselasia, permanent representative of Ethiopia to the United Nations, rebuffed the AG's statement as an unwarranted and overly exaggerated comment. The meeting by the AUPSC is expected to issue a communique expressing concern about the resumptions of hostilities and the toll on the civilians, as well as to welcome the 15 of the statements as the AU Commissioner Chairperson and his strong for an immediate unconditional ceasefire as the resumption of humanitarian services, according to Amani Africa. Upwards of 500,000 people in Tigray have fled to towns in Tigray due to the continued shelling and other atrocities by the occupying forces recently. According to Tigrayan civilian society sources, the displaced people are living in open, without food, water, the shelter, or trekking to the south in the desperate conditions that they're currently finding themselves in. According to the UN, just in Zelzali area of northwestern Tigray, there are about 210,000 newly displaced people in the dire situation, with the vast majority sleeping in open areas, who are directly exposed to cold weather and other protection risks as well. The IDPs are civilians displaced from all areas of northern Tigray, and the sources said civilians in Shira and Korem and Almata are also fleeing their homes to find shelter. The UN reported that civilians waiting to receive much-needed humanitarian assistance came under fire on the 14th of October, which caused injuries and even a loss of life. There are also reports that Eritrean forces are currently killing civilians in places that they are currently occupying as well. As we move on to our next update, Kenyan president raises concern of Ethiopia-Tigray war. In a speech that gave indicators of the path his administration will take in the region and the internationally known, Kenya's President William Ruto highlighted the regional consequences of the war in Tigray currently. Let's take a listen.
The conflict in Tigray region of Ethiopia, which according to reports from the Office of the United Nations Secretary General is escalating, is a great source of concern to our region.
He also stressed the need for urgent face-to-face negotiations to end the bloodshed any further.
Kenya will continue to play its role by making such contributions as is required by the Africa Union-sponsored mediation efforts. The sooner hostilities cease and a face-to-face talks commence, the better for our region.
Our final update for today, WHO chief warns that time is running out to prevent genocide of taking place in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, in his sharpest comments on the war yet, told reporters in Geneva on Wednesday that there is a very narrow window now to prevent any further atrocities to amount to a genocide in Tigray taking place in northern Ethiopia. Let's take a listen.
Earlier this week, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that, I quote, "The situation in Ethiopia is spiraling out of control. The social fabric is being ripped apart and civilians are paying a horrific price. Hostilities in Tigray must end now, including the immediate withdrawal and disengagement of Eritrean armed forces from Ethiopia." End of quote. The United Nations Human Rights Office has received reports of civilian casualties and destruction of civilian objects due to airstrikes and artillery strikes. Indiscriminate attacks or attacks that deliberately target civilians or civilian objects amount to war crimes. There is no other situation globally in which 6 million people have been kept under siege for almost 2 years. Banking, fuel, food, electricity, and healthcare are being used as weapons of war. Even people who have money are starving because they can't access their bank for 2 years. Children are dying every day from malnutrition. There are no services for tuberculosis, HIV, diabetes, hypertension, and more. Those diseases which are treatable elsewhere are now a death sentence in Tigray. Yes, I'm from Tigray, and yes, this affects me personally. But my job is to draw the world's attention to crises that threaten the health of people wherever they are. This is a health crisis for 6 million people, and the world is not paying enough attention. I urge the international community and the media to give this crisis the attention it deserves. There is a very narrow window now to prevent genocide.
Tedros added that food and health were being used as weapons of war in the Tigray region, which is largely cut off from the entirety of the outside world. That concludes our news for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.